My name is Nora, and for most of my life, I thought I understood my place in my family. I was the responsible daughter. The one who could handle things. The one who was expected to understand. And my brother Derek. He was the one everyone protected. For years, I told myself that it didn't matter. I told myself that every family had its differences. Some parents were closer to one child than another. Some children needed more help. Some children were simply more demanding. I kept making excuses for them because admitting the truth hurt too much. The truth was that my parents had spent most of my life teaching me that my needs came second. I just never expected them to prove it so clearly. It all started with one phone call. A phone call that completely changed the way I saw my family. Before I tell you what happened, though, you need to understand who I was before that day. For the last 8 years, I had worked incredibly hard to build a life of my own. I owned a small interior design and custom furniture studio. It wasn't some huge company with dozens of employees. It was something I had built slowly, piece by piece, with my own hands. Most mornings, I walked into my workshop wearing an old pair of jeans, a simple linen shirt, and the same worn leather apron I had owned for years. My hair was usually tied back because I didn't want it getting caught in anything. The smell of fresh wood filled the room. Sawdust covered the floor. Tools hung on the walls. The heater in the corner made strange noises, but I didn't care. I loved that place. Every table I built, every cabinet I designed, every piece of furniture I delivered reminded me that I had created something with my own effort. Nobody had handed it to me. Nobody had paid my way. Nobody had rescued me when things became difficult. I had done it myself. And maybe that's why my family always assumed I could handle everything. I had spent my entire childhood proving that I could. Growing up, there were rules in my family. Nobody ever wrote them down. Nobody ever announced them. But somehow, I always knew them. Derek came first. I came second. Derek was the only son, and my parents treated that fact like it was a special title. Whenever Derek wanted something, there was always a reason. Whenever I wanted something, there was always a lesson about responsibility. When Derek got a new bicycle, I was told to be understanding. When he wanted an expensive summer camp, I was told to be understanding. When his college tuition became a huge expense, my parents paid it without hesitation. I was working 3 part-time jobs at the time. I was trying to finish college while paying for it myself. There were nights when dinner was instant noodles because I needed the money for textbooks. I remember sitting at a tiny desk in my apartment, exhausted, trying to finish an assignment after working a late shift. Meanwhile, my brother's tuition payment was being sent directly from my parents' bank account. My mother would smile and say things like, "Girls don't need as much help, sweetheart. You're stronger." Back then, I didn't understand how unfair those words were. Now I do. She wasn't saying I was stronger because she believed in me. She was saying I could survive with less. So I learned to survive with less. I stopped asking. I stopped expecting. And eventually, I stopped telling my parents much about my life. It wasn't because I hated them. I didn't. I loved them. But I discovered something as I got older. I could breathe better when I wasn't constantly trying to earn their approval. Then I met Ethan. Ethan was different. He didn't see me as the responsible daughter. He didn't see me as the one who could handle everything. He saw me as Nora. Just Nora. He saw the woman who loved designing furniture, who could spend hours talking about wood finishes, who sometimes forgot to eat when she was working, and who got excited over the smallest details in a room. He loved me without asking me to prove that I deserved it. Eventually, we got married. Together, we bought a comfortable home in Highlands Ranch. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't flashy. But it was ours. We had quiet mornings with coffee on the porch. We talked about having children. We made lists of baby names even before we knew exactly when we would start our family. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had built something peaceful. I also owned a rental property in Lakewood. I had purchased it with money I had saved myself. It wasn't huge, but it was a good investment. A young couple named Jake and Amanda rented it. They were exactly the kind of tenants a landlord hopes for. They paid on time. They took care of the house. They didn't cause problems. They treated the property as if it mattered. I had no reason to ask them to leave. And I certainly wasn't going to throw them out just because my parents suddenly needed a place to stay. But I didn't know that was coming. One afternoon, my mother called me. She sounded incredibly excited. I was working in my studio when I answered. She started talking about the family home. The house they had lived in for 30 years. The house where I had grown up. The house with the porch swing my father built. The kitchen my mother had painted more times than I could remember. For a moment, I felt happy for them. I thought maybe they were finally ready for a simpler life. I imagined them moving somewhere smaller. Maybe they would travel. Maybe they would spend more time gardening. Maybe they would finally enjoy the years they had worked so hard for. Then my mother said something that made me go completely silent. We sold the house. Oh, I said. That's wonderful. How much did you get? She laughed. $650,000. I smiled. That's amazing. Then she said. And we gave it all to Derek. I thought I had misunderstood her. Sorry. You gave what to Derek? All of it, she said happily. The entire $650,000. I stopped moving. I remember staring at a piece of unfinished walnut sitting on my workbench. $650,000. Every dollar from the sale of their home. They had given it to my brother as a wedding gift. I waited for her to explain. Maybe Derek was buying a house. Maybe there was some family business involved. Maybe there was something I didn't understand. But no. She simply continued talking about how excited they were for him. Apparently, Derek and his new wife had found a beautiful penthouse downtown. My parents had decided to give them the money to help them begin their married life. I couldn't even speak. Then came the part that hurt even more. My mother said, "So we'll stay at your rental for a little while." I thought she was joking. What rental? The Lakewood house. I sat down. My tenants live there. Yes, I know. She said it as if that solved nothing. Just tell them they have to leave. I stared at the wall. For several seconds, I didn't say anything. My mother continued talking. She explained that they only needed the place temporarily. She said they would be careful. She said they were my parents. She said family should help family. But I barely heard her. All I could think about was one thing. They had given Derek $650,000. And now they expected me to give them my property. Not rent it to them. Not discuss it. Not ask my tenants if they had plans. They expected me to remove people from a home they had legally rented so my parents could move in. It wasn't a request. It was an order disguised as a family favor. I finally said, "Mom, I can't do that." Silence. Then she said, "What do you mean?" "I mean I can't just make them leave. They have a valid lease. You can talk to them." I already know what they're going to say. She became irritated. "Nora, they're just tenants. They're people, Mom." My voice was calm, but inside I was shaking. They have a home there. They pay me rent. They haven't done anything wrong. She sighed. "You've become very difficult." I almost laughed. Difficult. That word stayed in my head after we hung up. For my entire childhood, being easy was apparently my greatest responsibility. Easy to overlook. Easy to disappoint. Easy to ask for sacrifices. Now, the first time I said no, I was difficult. That evening, I told Ethan everything. He listened quietly while I talked. When I finished, he looked at me. "You're not actually thinking about evicting them, are you?" "No." The answer came immediately. "I would never do that." Ethan nodded. "Good. They're not doing anything wrong." "I know. And it's not even legal to just throw them out because my parents want the house." "I know." I looked down at my hands. I just knew this was going to happen. Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. "What?" The moment they gave Derek that money, I knew they were going to expect something from me. He didn't argue. Because he knew me well enough to understand. My parents didn't ask. They expected. And once I said no, everything changed. The phone calls started the next morning. First came my mother. Her voice was soft and emotional. "Nora, honey, you sounded upset yesterday." "I'm not upset. I'm just saying no. We're your parents. I know. We don't have anywhere to go. You could rent a place. Why should we spend money when you have an empty property?" "It's not empty." She became quiet. Then she said, "You care more about strangers than your own family." That sentence hurt. Even though I knew it wasn't fair, I explained everything again. The lease. The tenants. The law. The fact that Jake and Amanda had done nothing wrong. But my mother didn't want an explanation. She wanted obedience. Later that day, my father called. His tone was completely different. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He lectured me. "Your mother is extremely upset. I'm sorry she's upset. You should fix this." "I can't." "You can." "No, Dad. I can't. You need to start thinking about your family." "I am thinking about my family. I'm also thinking about people who haven't done anything wrong." He became angry. "You've always been selfish." That one hit me harder than I expected. Selfish. After everything I had done. After years of being the one who needed less. After watching my brother receive help while I worked for everything. I was selfish because I refused to throw two innocent people out of their home. By the next day, relatives started calling me. People I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly had strong opinions about my life. My Aunt Patricia called early in the morning. She didn't even say hello properly. "Your parents gave Derek everything they had to help him start his marriage, and you can't do one small thing for them? It's not a small thing. You're making it bigger than it is. I would have to remove my tenants. They can find somewhere else. So can my parents." She became silent. Then she said, "You're the successful one, Nora. You should help." There it was again. The same old family rule. Because I had worked hard, I was supposed to sacrifice more. Because I had built something, everyone believed they had a right to use it. Because I had survived without help, they assumed I didn't need boundaries. Then Derek texted me. His message was short. "They need somewhere to stay. Be flexible, sis." I stared at those words for a long time. Be flexible. That was easy for him to say. He was sitting comfortably in a new home funded by $650,000 from our parents. My parents had given him everything. And now they wanted me to give up something too. I didn't answer. 3 days later, everything exploded. I was in my workshop sanding the edge of a maple countertop when my phone started buzzing repeatedly. It was Jake. I answered immediately. "Nora." His voice sounded nervous. "What happened?" "There are people at the door." My stomach dropped. "What people?" He hesitated. "Your parents." I stopped breathing for a second. "What?" "They have suitcases." I put down the sandpaper. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "They're telling us they're moving in." I stood there in the middle of my workshop, surrounded by furniture I had built with my own hands. My parents had ignored my answer. They had ignored the lease. They had ignored my tenants. They had ignored every boundary I had tried to set. They had simply shown up with suitcases. As if my property belonged to them. As if my life belonged to them. As if saying no to them had never mattered. I grabbed my keys. But before I left the workshop, I stopped. Something inside me had changed. For years, I had been trying to keep the peace. I had swallowed my anger. I had explained myself. I had apologized when I wasn't wrong. I had stayed quiet because I didn't want to be called difficult. I had spent my entire life trying to make things easier for everyone else. But standing there, listening to Jake's frightened voice on the phone, I finally understood something. My parents weren't asking me for help anymore. They were trying to take control of my life. And this time, I wasn't going to let them. I drove to the property with my heart pounding. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say. But I knew one thing. The daughter they thought would always give in was gone. I had spent years building my life. I had earned my home. I had earned my business. I had earned my peace. And I was done letting my family treat everything I had built as if it belonged to them. What happened next was the moment my family finally realized that I wasn't the same girl they had spent years telling to be understanding. I was Nora. And for the first time in my life, I was going to choose myself. They're yelling outside. The first thing I heard was the sound of my husband's voice through the phone. They're yelling. My heart dropped. I froze in the middle of what I was doing. Who? I asked, even though a strange feeling in my stomach was already giving me the answer. There's an older couple outside, he said. They said they're your parents. Of course they did. For a second, I just stood there staring at the wall. My parents. After everything that had happened, I should have expected this. Still, hearing that they were standing outside our house made my chest tighten. Listen to me, I said quickly. Do not open the door. Stay inside. I'm coming home right now. Okay. And don't argue with them. I won't. I ended the call, grabbed my keys, and hurried outside. There was still dust on my jeans from earlier, but I didn't care. I got into my car and started driving across Denver. My hands were tight around the steering wheel. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel every beat in my chest. I kept thinking the same thing. Why were they here? I already knew the answer. They had nowhere else to go. But that was not my fault. My parents had made their own decisions. They had sold their house. They had given away their savings. They had trusted my brother Derek with an unbelievable amount of money. And now, somehow, they expected me to fix everything. When I finally turned onto our street in Lakewood, I saw them immediately. They were standing on the front porch. My mother was pounding on the door with both hands. My father stood beside her, stiff and angry. And next to them were two huge suitcases. There were grocery bags hanging from my mother's wrist. For one ridiculous second, they looked like tourists who had arrived at a vacation rental. Except this wasn't a vacation. They were trying to move into my home. I parked my car and stepped out. The moment my mother saw me, she turned around. Her face changed instantly. She looked angry, relieved, hurt, and offended all at the same time. What are you doing? I asked. My mother pointed toward the house. They won't let us in. I looked at my husband through the window. He was standing safely inside. I turned back to her. Of course they won't. She stared at me. This is family property. No, I said calmly. It isn't. Yes, it is. Mom, this is my rental. You don't live here. Her expression hardened. We're your parents. I know who you are. Then how can you treat us like strangers? My father finally stepped forward. We've been sitting in a hotel for almost 2 weeks waiting for you to handle this. I stared at him. You created this situation. He frowned. You're our daughter. And you're both adults. My voice was shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. You sold your house. You gave your money to Derek. You made those decisions without asking me. You cannot suddenly decide that my home is your backup plan. My mother put a hand over her heart. How can you talk to us this way after everything we've done for you? There it was. That sentence. The sentence they had used my entire life whenever I refused to do what they wanted. After everything we've done for you. It was supposed to make me feel guilty. It used to work. This time, it didn't. My husband opened the front door just an inch. Do we need to call someone? He asked quietly. I looked at him. No. Then I turned back toward my parents. But they will if you don't leave. The porch went completely silent. It was the kind of silence that feels louder than shouting. My mother stared at me. My father looked furious. For the first time, I realized something very clearly. They weren't confused. They weren't helpless. They weren't simply desperate parents who had made one bad decision. They believed they were entitled to my life. They believed my home was available to them. They believed my money should be available to them. They believed that because I was their daughter, I had a responsibility to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. And I knew that if I gave in even once, this would never stop. My father picked up one of the suitcases. "This isn't over," he muttered. "I know," I said. My mother started crying. Not quietly. She cried loudly enough that I saw one of the neighbors move behind a window curtain. She kept saying things about how cruel I was and how she couldn't believe her own daughter would treat her this way. Then they finally walked back to their car. I watched them put the suitcases into the trunk. I watched my mother wipe her face. I watched my father slam the trunk shut. Then they drove away. I stood there for a long time. I expected to feel guilty. Instead, I felt empty. There was a cold ache in my chest, but it wasn't guilt. It was realization. This was only the beginning. I was right. The next morning, my phone started buzzing before sunrise. The first message came from my cousin Brandon. "I can't believe you would abandon your parents like this." I stared at the screen. Before I could even respond, another message appeared. This one was from Aunt Patricia. "We heard you refused to let your parents stay with you. They're practically homeless." Homeless. I read the word twice. My parents had voluntarily sold their home. They had willingly handed their money to Derek. They had made those decisions because they believed Derek's plans would work. Now that those plans were falling apart, somehow I was responsible. My phone kept buzzing. Someone had added me to a family group chat. Messages were coming in one after another. Family should help family. You only get one set of parents. Respect your elders. How could you turn them away? Think about what people are going to say. Not one person asked what actually happened. Not one person asked why my parents had sold their house. Not one person asked where their money went. Not one person asked about my husband. Not one person asked whether my parents had permission to move into our home. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain. And apparently, they had already chosen me. I sat at the kitchen island reading the messages one by one. My husband sat beside me. I had one hand resting on my belly. He looked at my phone and then looked at me. "You can block them." "I know. You don't have to keep reading this." "I know. But knowing something and being able to ignore it are two different things." I finally put my phone down. The truth was, blocking them wasn't going to solve the real problem. My parents believed they had unlimited access to my life. My home. My money. My time. My future. And if I allowed this to continue, they would keep finding ways to push their problems onto me. I couldn't let that happen. Not anymore. Not with the future I was trying to build. Around that time, information about Derek started coming out. One of my cousins, Maria, was one of the few people in the family who didn't automatically take sides. She called me and told me what she had heard. Derek's mortgage application had been denied. The bank needed proof of income. He didn't have enough. Without the mortgage, he couldn't close on the penthouse he wanted. And without the closing, the money my parents had given him wasn't coming back. I sat quietly while Maria explained everything. Then the numbers started making sense. My parents hadn't simply given Derek a little financial help. They had put almost everything they had into his plans. $650,000. Their entire nest egg. And now it was trapped. Suddenly, their desperation made sense. They weren't knocking on my door because they suddenly missed me. They needed somewhere to live. They needed money. They needed someone to rescue them. And they had decided that person was me. 2 days later, Derek called me himself. I almost didn't answer. But I did. "Hello." There was no apology in his voice. No embarrassment. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Instead, he sounded annoyed. "Look," he said. "Things are tight right now." I said nothing. "Brittany and I still need to pay the venue." I frowned. "What venue?" "Our wedding venue." I closed my eyes. Of course. The wedding. After everything, they were still planning their wedding as if nothing had happened. Derek continued. "It's only $18,000. Can you help?" I actually laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Only $18,000? Yeah. He said it like $18,000 was pocket change. Like I kept stacks of money hidden in my kitchen cabinets for emergencies. Derek, no. There was silence on the other end. Then his voice changed. Wow. I knew exactly what was coming. Real supportive, sis. I took a deep breath. Supportive? Yes. You're asking me for $18,000 after mom and dad gave you $650,000. That money was for the penthouse. And now they're homeless. They're not homeless. They were standing on my porch with suitcases. Derek didn't answer. I could feel my anger rising. You and Brittany need to stop expecting everyone else to pay for your plans. You don't understand. No, I said. I understand perfectly. He hung up. That night, the family messages started again. Some people told me I needed to help Derek. Others said I should let my parents stay with me. One relative even suggested that I was being selfish because I had a stable home and a future ahead of me. I read the messages until I couldn't take it anymore. Then I put my phone down. Something inside me had changed. I wasn't going to keep defending myself against every accusation. I wasn't going to argue with 20 relatives. I wasn't going to explain my life over and over again. And I wasn't going to keep allowing other people to rewrite the truth. I opened my laptop. I sat at the kitchen table. For a few seconds, I just stared at the blank screen. Then I started typing. I wasn't going to write an angry message. I wasn't going to insult anyone. I wasn't going to beg them to understand. I was going to write the facts. Every important fact. The house my parents had sold. The money they had given Derek. The decisions they had made. The attempts to move into my home without permission. The messages from relatives. The request for $18,000. I wanted everything written down clearly. No screaming. No drama. No emotional manipulation. Just the truth. Because I had finally understood something. When people are determined to misunderstand you, explaining yourself emotionally only gives them more words to twist. So I decided to give them facts instead. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and began writing. For the first time in days, I felt calm. I didn't know what would happen after I sent that email. I didn't know how my parents would react. I didn't know how many relatives would turn against me. But I knew one thing. I was done being the emergency plan for people who never thought twice about putting themselves first. This time, I was going to protect my home, my marriage, my future, and my peace. And I wasn't going to apologize for it. I wrote everything down. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to embarrass my parents. And not because I enjoyed seeing their lives fall apart. I wrote it down because, for the first time in my life, I needed the truth to speak louder than guilt. I made a clear timeline of everything that had happened. I included copies of the lease, messages, records of the sale, dates, screenshots, and every important conversation I had saved. I checked everything twice before sending it because I knew exactly what would happen if I left even one detail unclear. My parents would say I was lying. Derek would say I was being selfish. Someone would claim that I had misunderstood the situation. So I gave them nothing to misunderstand. I explained what happened in simple, direct words. I explained when my parents had asked me for help, what they expected me to do, how I had responded, and why I had refused. I included the documents that proved my side of the story. At the very end of the email, I added one sentence. If anyone believes my parents deserve housing more than my tenants do, please let me know when they can move in with you. Then I stared at the screen for a few seconds. My finger hovered over the send button. Part of me wanted to delete the whole thing. The old version of me, the daughter who had spent years keeping everyone happy, was screaming inside my head. Don't make things worse. Don't embarrass them. Just stay quiet. But I was tired of staying quiet. So I clicked send. 30 people received that email. Family members. Relatives. People who had heard only my parents' version of the story. People who had judged me without ever asking what actually happened. The email was out. There was no taking it back. The next morning, the family group chat was completely silent. Not one message. Not one angry reply. Not even a simple good morning. At first, I didn't know what to think. The silence after the email lasted almost an entire day. And, strangely enough, that gave me a little hope. Maybe it was finally over. Maybe everyone had seen the evidence. Maybe my parents had realized they couldn't control the story anymore. Maybe, just maybe, the worst part was behind me. But I had learned something important about entitlement. It doesn't always disappear when you confront it. Sometimes it becomes quiet. Sometimes it changes its clothes. Sometimes it comes back looking softer, kinder, and more harmless than before. That was exactly what happened. It was a Saturday morning in early spring. The weather was beautiful. Sunlight came through the kitchen windows and covered the counters with warm golden light. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Ethan and I were standing in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about baby names. We had been arguing playfully about which names sounded terrible and which ones might actually work. I laughed so hard at one of his suggestions that I nearly spilled my coffee. For a few minutes, I forgot everything. I forgot the arguments. I forgot the messages. I forgot the pressure. I forgot my parents. My shoulders finally felt relaxed. My phone wasn't buzzing every few minutes. My parents hadn't called. Derek hadn't called. Nobody was demanding anything from me. The peace felt strange. But it also felt wonderful. Then the doorbell rang. Once. Then again. Then again. It wasn't the normal polite ring of someone standing outside waiting patiently. It was constant and impatient. Ethan stopped talking. He looked toward the front window. "That's strange," he said. Then he walked over and looked outside. His expression changed. "Nora," he said quietly, "it's them." My stomach tightened. I didn't need to ask who he meant. I picked up my phone and opened the Ring camera. There they were. My parents. Standing on my front porch. They were dressed nicely, almost as if they were going to a family dinner. Mom was holding a bouquet of flowers. Dad had a grocery bag in his hand. For a second, I just stared at the screen. It was such a normal-looking scene that someone who didn't know the history might have thought it was sweet. A mother and father visiting their pregnant daughter. Flowers. Groceries. Smiles. Except I knew better. My mother leaned closer to the camera. She smiled. "Sweetheart," she said, "we brought everything to make your favorite pot roast. Please let us in." My chest tightened. That voice. That gentle voice. It brought back years of memories. Whenever I was a child and my mother wanted something from me, she rarely demanded it directly. She would make me feel guilty first. She would sound hurt. She would remind me of everything she had done for me. And somehow, I would end up apologizing. Even when I hadn't done anything wrong. I could feel that old instinct waking up inside me. Open the door. Make peace. Don't make Mom upset. Just let them in. Ethan looked at me. "Nora," he said quietly, "this is manipulation." I knew he was right. I took a slow breath. Dad stepped closer to the camera. "We've had time to think," he said. "We made mistakes. Let's just talk like adults." I almost laughed. Talk like adults. My father had used that sentence many times throughout my life. Usually, it meant that he wanted the conversation to happen on his terms. It sounded reasonable. It sounded mature. But underneath it was always the same message. Stop arguing. Stop defending yourself. Do what I want. I stayed where I was. I didn't open the door. Mom's smile slowly disappeared. Her voice became softer. "Please, honey. We've been staying somewhere awful. We're exhausted. We miss you." I looked at Ethan. He shook his head. "They aren't here to apologize," he whispered. "They're here to get access." He was right. Because every apology my parents had given me came with a condition. "I'm sorry, but we didn't mean it that way, but you know how much we've sacrificed for you." And somehow, every apology ended with the same request. They wanted me to give them something. My home. My money. My space. My peace. When I didn't answer, my father's voice changed. The softness disappeared. "Nora, this is childish. Open the door. Mom immediately became louder. We are your parents. You owe us respect. Respect. They said the word as if being my parents gave them unlimited access to my life. I stood there silently. I didn't open the door. Dad stepped away from the camera and crossed his arms. If you don't let us in, he said, we'll stay right here until you do. My heart was beating hard. But I wasn't panicking. Something inside me was strangely calm. I realized this was the moment they had been pushing toward. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to become the old Nora again. The daughter who couldn't stand seeing her parents angry. The daughter who would give in just to stop the argument. The daughter who believed saying no made her a bad person. But that girl was gone. I looked at Ethan. He didn't tell me what to do. He simply stood beside me. That was enough. I picked up my phone. Then I called the non-emergency police line. When the operator answered, I spoke slowly. I need to report people refusing to leave my property. They're the same people involved in a previous incident connected to my rental property. Ethan looked at me. There was pride in his eyes. And something about that made me realize how much I had changed. A few years ago, I would have been shaking. I would have been apologizing. I would have been asking myself whether I was being too harsh. Now I wasn't. I was protecting my home. I was protecting my peace. I was protecting the life Ethan and I were building together. Outside, my parents kept talking. They didn't know I had already made the call. Mom suddenly tried a different approach. Think about the baby, she pleaded. My pregnancy had become another tool they could use. Don't you want us to be part of our grandchild's life? I closed my eyes for a second. Of course I wanted my child to have loving grandparents. But not grandparents who believed love meant ownership. Not grandparents who thought being family gave them the right to ignore boundaries. Not grandparents who showed up at my door after I had repeatedly told them no. Not like this. Dad knocked again. Harder this time. Nora, stop being dramatic. I almost laughed. They were standing outside my house with flowers and groceries, refusing to leave, after everything that had happened. And somehow, I was the dramatic one. A few minutes later, I saw the police car turn onto our street. My parents noticed it almost immediately. Their faces changed. Mom's smile disappeared. Dad's jaw tightened. For the first time that morning, they looked uncertain. The officer walked toward them calmly. Sir, he said, the homeowner has asked you to leave the property. Mom pointed toward our house. She's confused. We're her parents. I stepped closer to the doorway. Before I could say anything, Ethan spoke. She's not confused. The officer nodded. You've been asked to leave before. You need to go now. My father looked toward the camera. Then he looked directly at me. His face was hard. You'll regret this, Nora. I waited for the fear to come. It didn't. I didn't feel regret. I felt relief. My parents walked back toward their car slowly. They made the whole thing feel like a performance. Mom kept looking back toward the house. Dad walked with stiff shoulders. It was almost as if they wanted someone watching to feel sorry for them. But there was no audience anymore. The car door slammed. The engine started. Then they drove away. I stood there watching until the car disappeared around the corner. When the officer finally left, Ethan came over and wrapped his arms around me. I leaned against him. And something happened that I hadn't expected. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't feel guilty. Instead, I felt something inside me unlock. It was quiet. Almost invisible. But it was real. It felt like I had been holding my breath for years. And finally, I let it out. For the first time, I understood what freedom could feel like. But the day wasn't finished. That evening, my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. Derek. I stared at his name for a few seconds. I almost ignored the call. But curiosity got the better of me. I answered. What did you do? He demanded. No hello. No question about whether I was okay. Just anger. Mom is hysterical, he continued. Dad is furious. I took a breath. I protected my home. You humiliated them. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. They came to my house and refused to leave. They're your parents. And I'm their daughter, I said. That doesn't mean they can ignore my boundaries. Derek scoffed. You know what? This is unbelievable. They gave you everything you needed to build your future, and you can't even give them a place to stay? There it was. The truth. The entire family belief system in one sentence. They had given me things. Therefore, they believed they owned me. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, they gave me things. Derek didn't respond. They helped me in some ways, I continued. I won't deny that. But they didn't give me ownership of my life. Another silence. Then I said the sentence I had been afraid to say for years. They gave you everything. I paused. They didn't give me everything. Derek knew exactly what I meant. They gave me food. They gave me a home. They paid for certain things. They supported me in ways that I was grateful for. But they also gave me guilt. They gave me pressure. They gave me fear of disappointing them. They taught me that love meant obedience. And now they wanted me to repay every good thing they had ever done by surrendering my life to them. Derek's voice became cold. You're going to pay for this. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't beg him to understand. I simply ended the call. I put my phone down. And for once, I didn't feel the need to defend myself to anyone. But the real ending didn't come that night. It came 2 days later. That afternoon, a plain envelope was delivered to my parents' new apartment. It was the apartment they had finally rented after every other option had fallen apart. Inside was a formal notice prepared by my attorney. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't insulting. There were no angry words. No threats. No family drama. Just facts. Dates. Documents. Boundaries. Legal instructions. Everything they had refused to hear from me was now written in language they could not twist into an emotional argument. I held my copy of the notice in my hands and stared at it for a long time. I expected to feel guilty. I expected to wonder if I had gone too far. Instead, I felt calm. I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Setting a boundary doesn't make you cruel. Protecting your home doesn't make you selfish. Saying no to your parents doesn't mean you don't love them. And being grateful for what someone has done for you doesn't mean you owe them your entire future. For most of my life, I had confused peace with silence. I thought keeping everyone happy was the same thing as having a good family. It wasn't. Real peace came when I stopped allowing other people to destroy my happiness just because they were related to me. That Saturday morning, when my parents stood outside my door with flowers and groceries, they thought they were still dealing with the same daughter who would eventually give in. They were wrong. I wasn't the little girl standing in the middle of every family argument, trying to make everyone happy. I wasn't the daughter who believed she had to earn love. I was a grown woman. I was building a family of my own. I had a home. I had a husband who stood beside me. I had a child on the way. And I had finally learned that protecting those things was not something I needed to apologize for. My parents had spent years telling me that family should always come first. For the first time, I understood what that really meant. My family came first, too. But now, I got to decide who my family was. And I got to decide what kind of life we would have. The letter my attorney sent was simple. There were no emotional words in it. No insults. No arguments. No long explanation. It simply told my parents to stop coming onto my property without permission and warned them that any further attempts would be documented and could lead to additional legal action. Every future incident would be recorded. Every message would be saved. Every attempt to enter my property would be reported if necessary. For once, there was nothing for them to argue with. According to Maria, my parents went completely pale when they read the letter. She told me they didn't look angry. They didn't look heartbroken either. They looked shocked. It was almost as if they couldn't believe that I had actually gone through with it. I think they had always believed there would be a point where I would get tired. They thought I would eventually become emotional, feel guilty, and come running back. They had spent years depending on that. But this time, I didn't. I had finally stopped explaining myself. And that changed everything. The weeks that followed were surprisingly quiet. At first, the silence made me nervous. I kept checking my phone. Every unknown number made me wonder if another problem was coming. Every car that slowed down near our house caught my attention. I had spent so long waiting for the next argument that peace almost felt suspicious. But slowly, I realized the fighting really was ending. My parents moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't anything like the life they had imagined for themselves. It wasn't the comfortable home they had once expected to have. It certainly wasn't the future they thought they were going to build after giving Derek $650,000. But it was what they could afford. And, for the first time, their housing situation was no longer my responsibility. That was an important thing for me to accept. I had spent so many years believing that if someone I loved was struggling, I had to fix it. Even when they had created the problem themselves. Even when helping them meant hurting myself. Even when they treated my kindness like an obligation. I finally understood that being someone's daughter didn't mean I had to rescue them from every consequence of their own decisions. The calls from relatives also became less frequent. At first, some of them had been very confident. They had told me I was selfish. They had told me I was cruel. They had said I should remember everything my parents had done for me. But once they saw the documents, the lease records, the messages, and the police report, their confidence slowly disappeared. It is easy to judge someone when you only know one side of the story. It is much harder when the facts are sitting in front of you. People stopped sending me angry messages. The family group chat became quiet. Some relatives never apologized. Some simply disappeared. And honestly, I learned to be okay with that. I didn't need everyone to admit I was right. I only needed to know that I had done what was right for my own life. There is something I learned during that time. Entitlement is very loud when people think they can get away with it. It demands. It threatens. It creates guilt. It tells everyone how unfair you are. But entitlement becomes much quieter when people stop feeding it. That was exactly what happened. The more I stopped responding, the less power the drama had over me. Meanwhile, Jake and Amanda stayed in the Lakewood house. They were still living there peacefully. They treated the home with respect. They took care of everything. They even started working on the backyard. One afternoon, Jake sent me a picture of the garden they had planted. There were small plants lined up neatly in the soil. Amanda had added flowers around the edges. The message was simple. We finally got the garden started. Thank you again. I stared at that picture for a long time. It meant more to me than they probably realized. These were the people my parents had been so willing to push out. These were the tenants my parents believed should simply step aside because they wanted the property. But Jake and Amanda had never demanded anything from me. They had respected the agreement. They had paid what they owed. They had treated me fairly. And most importantly, they had treated my property like someone else's home because they understood that it was. Seeing that garden made me realize something. I had chosen the right people to protect. Not because they were perfect. Not because they owed me anything. But because they respected me. And respect matters more than family titles. Back at home, things finally became quiet. Real quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence that happens after a fight. Not the silence where everyone is angry but pretending nothing happened. This was different. It was peaceful. The kind of peace that slowly settles into the walls of your home. The kind that makes you stop looking at your phone every 5 minutes. The kind that lets you sleep without wondering what tomorrow's argument will be about. Ethan and I started preparing the nursery. We had talked about it for months, but everything had been pushed aside because of the problems with my parents. Now we could finally focus on our baby. One afternoon, we stood together in the nursery painting the walls a soft green. There was paint on Ethan's hands. There was paint on my shirt. At one point, he accidentally got a tiny spot of paint on my cheek. I laughed. He laughed. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about my parents. I wasn't thinking about Derek. I wasn't thinking about lawyers or police officers or family arguments. I was simply standing in a room that would soon belong to my child. Every brushstroke felt important. I wasn't just painting a wall. I felt like I was rebuilding my life. I was creating a safe space. A peaceful space. A place where my child would grow up without learning that love means giving up your boundaries. That thought stayed with me. Because when I looked back at my childhood, I realized how much of myself I had given away just to keep other people happy. I had made myself smaller. I had stayed quiet. I had accepted disrespect because I was told I needed to be understanding. I had apologized when I wasn't wrong. I had said yes when I wanted to say no. And I had convinced myself that this was what good daughters did. But it wasn't. Good daughters are allowed to have boundaries. Good daughters are allowed to build their own lives. Good daughters are allowed to say no. And they are allowed to protect their peace. For the first time in my life, nobody was questioning my boundaries. Nobody was punishing me for having them. They simply existed. And on the other side of those boundaries was a life I had never realized I could have. A peaceful life. A quiet home. A husband who supported me. A baby on the way. And a future that belonged to me. People sometimes asked me what the hardest part of everything had been. They assumed I would say calling the police on my own parents. It wasn't. That part was difficult, but it was clear. They were on my property. They had been told to leave. They refused. I made a decision. The hardest part came much earlier. The hardest part was realizing how long I had been living smaller than I needed to. The hardest part was realizing how often I had ignored my own feelings just to keep everyone else comfortable. The hardest part was accepting that the peace I had worked so hard to maintain wasn't really peace. It was surrender. I had mistaken silence for harmony. I had mistaken guilt for love. I had mistaken obedience for respect. And once I understood that, everything changed. Real peace doesn't require you to disappear. Real peace doesn't require you to accept disrespect. Real peace doesn't ask you to destroy yourself so someone else can stay comfortable. Peace should make room for you, too. That was the lesson I wanted to carry into motherhood. I didn't want my child to grow up believing that family members were allowed to hurt each other simply because they shared the same blood. I didn't want my child to believe that love came with a price tag. I didn't want my child to learn that saying no made you selfish. I wanted to teach my child something different. I wanted them to know that love and boundaries can exist together. You can love someone and still say no. You can forgive someone and still keep your distance. You can be grateful for what someone has done for you without giving them control over your future. And you can choose peace without feeling guilty about it. My parents may never understand the line I drew. Maybe they will always believe I was wrong. Maybe they will tell their version of the story for the rest of their lives. I can't control that anymore. And honestly, I don't want to. For years, I tried to control what everyone thought of me. I wanted everyone to understand me. I wanted everyone to approve of my decisions. I wanted my parents to finally look at me and say, "We're proud of you." But I learned that sometimes you have to stop waiting for people to give you permission to live your own life. I don't need their approval anymore. I know who I am. I know what happened. I know why I made the choices I made. And most importantly, I know what kind of home I want to create for my child. A home where love is freely given. A home where people can speak honestly. A home where saying no isn't treated like betrayal. A home where nobody has to earn their right to feel safe. That is the legacy I choose. Not the arguments. Not the guilt. Not the fear. Not the endless pressure to keep everyone else happy. I choose love. I choose peace. I choose boundaries. And I choose a future where my child grows up knowing that their voice matters. Looking back now, I realize that the day I finally stopped surrendering wasn't the day I lost my family. It was the day I found myself. And once I found myself, I discovered that I had a life worth protecting. A life I didn't have to apologize for. A life I didn't have to shrink. A life that finally felt like mine. If any part of my story sounds familiar to you, I hope you know that you're not alone. If you've ever felt guilty for saying no to someone you love, Remember this. Having a boundary doesn't make you a bad person. Protecting your peace doesn't make you selfish. And choosing your own future doesn't mean you don't care about your family. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stop surrendering. Sometimes, saying enough is the beginning of a completely different life. And for me, it was. This is the life I choose now. And I wouldn't go back.